So this week we are looking at animation, getting started in here. And the first thing we need to talk about is actually the fact that this program is based off of people who learned about animation on film. So these are all graphic things, they're not actual film reels. But the idea here is that, excuse me, when you are working with film, you're actually working with a series of still images. So even though 35 millimeter, um, here we go. Here's some actual film. So we call it motion picture, but it's actually a series of stills that are taken in quick succession. And so the projector will open up an aperture, or actually, not the projector. Let's see, camera. I spelled it wrong. That's okay. So what happens with the camera is that it will open up the shutter, allow the light through to the film, and then close the shutter, and then it will move the film, advance the film, and then will open up the shutter again. And so when it comes to motion picture, there is no motion. It's fake. It's a misnomer, and it's a trick that works because our eyes have things like the image basically stays on your eye, and we have a psychological phenomenon that determines we can see things in motion when they're not. And so this program is based off of that idea, and it's hard to see because they're very tiny, but this timeline is made up of frames. It lists seconds above it, and if we click on the background to get properties for the document, you can see we're running at 24 frames a second. That's a standard film rate. I wouldn't move away from that for right now. But this whole idea of animation deals with frames. So that's what we have to learn about right now. To start off with, we're actually going to make a new document. And you need to make sure, it's much more important now than it ever has been, you have to be dealing with ActionScript 3.0. The reason for that is all of these other file types have different underlying architectures. They're very limited because you're dealing with certain devices and things like that, or HTML5 is dealing with a browser. And so it limits what you can do. And we need there to be no limits. And ActionScript 3.0 is, we don't use action scripting anymore, but that file type has the most range. And I'm just giving myself kind of like a wide area to work in. Oh, it's not that wide, that's okay. And the other thing we need to do is create the right type of object to work with in animation. So I'm just going to create a star, nothing fancy. But whatever you create, you have to be able to have it be a particular kind of object. Now you can turn on object drawing if you want. It's not necessary, because whatever you end up doing, let me bring this up a little bit. There we go. Whatever you end up doing with this, you're going to have to turn it into a symbol. So remember that turning things into a symbol is a matter of right click, convert to symbol. You don't want to see that. And you're going to make it a movie clip. So we're just going to have it be a movie clip. I'm going to call it star. Doesn't really matter that much. But in order for any of the animation tools to work properly, you should be working with movie clips for everything. Not groups, not drawn objects, not, hey, I'm going to select this over here and click the button that puts it in a box. No, no, no. It has to be very specifically a symbol. And there's just a lot of underlying technical reasons for that. Suffice it to say that if you don't do that, you're going to run into problems later. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that when you have things that are a symbol, you can end up accidentally breaking them a little bit. So we can see the center point is here on the star. If I double click this, if I move this over here, just say I accidentally double clicked it, I didn't realize I was moving it, I move it over here, and I go, oh crap, I gotta go back out here. And we think it all looks okay. But see this center point? The symbol is actually this big. We've moved it away from its center point. Right? The center point should be at the center. Actually, I'm just going to undo to put it really back at the center. So if you end up with this anchor point somewhere off over here, or something like that, you just have to be very careful. We are entering the realm of you have to be very careful in all the things that you do. Otherwise, you can break things pretty wonderfully. Okay, so we have a symbol. It is a movie clip. And if you go up to your layer, you can actually see that by default, there is a frame. It's one frame, right? So we just need to add more. More frames equals more time. And the way we do that on the timeline, there's a lot of different ways to get to this. There's hotkeys, there's the menu. We're going to use the right click menu for now just because there's fewer things in there. It's a little bit easier, it's a little bit more limiting. But if I go to 2 seconds out and I right click and I say insert frame, see how the timeline fills in? I now have 2 seconds worth of animation, and this red bar is the time marker, and I can drag it back and forth. Now nothing happens yet, right? Because we don't have any changes happening. But we at least have time. I could hit the play button and it would play this non-motion for 2 seconds. Now here's the trick. How do we get motion? Well, we need to include something called a keyframe. Let's see. So here we go. In keyframe animation, what happens is you plan what you're going to do, and you can see these two dark images. Bird's got his head tilted one side, bird got his head tilted to the other side. You draw those first. Those are your keyframes. We've got another one here. Character is standing. They crouch down. They jump up. These particular poses, these key poses, in drawn animation, they'd be known as keyframes. And then the animator would go in and they would in-between. Now, we're going to learn some tools where the computer does some of the in-betweening for us. Not anything as sophisticated as moving arms and legs separately, but at least when we're sliding objects across the screen, we can, the computer can do the in-betweening. But this idea of a keyframe comes from that tradition, comes from drawn animation. So, if I go to the end of this block, keep in mind this little rectangle that's at the end of a span of frames, it's a meaningless marker. It's really annoying. It doesn't mean anything special. It just means the end of the section. That frame is no different than all of the other previous frames. But if I select that end frame and I right click and I say insert keyframe, well, now we've got a whole other thing. You can see that there's actually like a little bit of a line there indicating that we've got a different segment. And this keyframe, you can see it's like a dot and it's filled in. It is now a different separate thing from this section. These frames all look to this first keyframe and say, okay, do this. Well, now we've got a new keyframe, which means if I slide this over, and then I go back to my timeline and I draw my time marker back, we get this. Right? This is how keyframes work. Keyframe A, keyframe B. Things stay the same till we get to the next keyframe. If I was to move further forward and insert frame, well, now it's going to stay here until I right-click Insert Keyframe and make a new keyframe. And now this is going to move. All right. Now, it's not animation yet. What's one thing we could get it to be animation? Well, more keyframes. I can right-click Insert. Nope, just kidding. Right-click Insert Keyframe. Drag this sort of halfway in between here. And in ye olde days of animation, you would have to... It's not in the middle. Manually do this like this. And this is just a simple slide across the screen. Imagine redrawing a character. But you see, if I drag this really fast, it starts to look like motion. There's a psychological phenomenon. Your brain is saying, oh, if it went from point A to point B, it moved there. There's also persistence of vision, so the idea of where this is stays in your eyeball, even as it gets to here. And so we kind of, it's almost like an internal biological motion blur. We see nothing's blinking per se. You've probably seen a lot of optical illusions where stare at something over here and then look at a white screen, and you see the inverse of it. That's persistence of vision. All right, so we're going to take this idea of multiple frames close together, and we're going to do an exercise that's out of the book. It's page 158, and this was the in-class assignment from this week. And it's about taking a bouncing ball, which is already, it's a graphic technically, but it's still a symbol. And we're going to duplicate it, and we're going to create a bouncing ball animation. And there's actually an example of one here. You can actually look up bouncing ball animation. This is huge. This is like the animation exercise that everyone learns in every animation school ever. Why? Well, because it's simple, because it deals with keyframes, because there's a little bit of squash and stretch if you want to add it in. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's way more complex than you think it is. All right, we're learning it so we can learn how to press all the right buttons. But I also want to just introduce you guys to the idea of how animation works. So, first things first, step 1 in your book actually says to create a new document, create a thing, put a gradient, and make it a symbol. They already did that. And then step 2 goes right into placing all of the different little balls so that we can see the animation. But I am going to add a little bit of a thing. I am going to name that layer ball. And I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to call it guide. I need a guide. Not everyone does. Plenty of your classmates are going to draw this without any guide. But I need to grab my paintbrush tool, and I need to just... That's way too much. There we go. I need to have a little bit of a line. That is still too big. And I need to be able to kind of draw myself. This is a terrible line because I'm drawing with a mouse. I need to be able to draw myself some sort of a guide. I need to be able to say, okay, it's going to bounce here and here and here. So I can mark that it's bouncing off the screen because I still have to, bring it here. And then I'm also going to mark how much it's dropping off, how fast it's dropping off in terms of losing its energy and where it bounces. And actually, if I'm doing this properly, if we want to get really technical, it can lose its bounce energy along some kind of exponent, basically. So it should almost curve down rather than linearly come down. But these should actually be mostly equidistant. Because in physics, the energy that is sending the ball sideways is not getting stopped by anything except air resistance, which is not, practically speaking, going to do much. And it might lose a little bit on the bounce. But gravity is the main force here. So gravity is like pulling it down. So each time it bounces up, it doesn't bounce as high. That's what's going on here. So it should laterally travel at a similar speed, but the gravity is going to pull it down each time. So I have those on the guide layer. I'm going to lock the guide layer. I'm going to go back to this. Now, there's a lot of ways we can build this up, and you're doing this in order. This is straight ahead animation. It's the only time you're going to do straight ahead animation in my class. I can sit there and copy paste, but it brings it over there, which is annoying. And if you consider how many of these you're going to have to make, I just like that idea immensely of doing that. So instead, we are going to use, there's 2 different ways to do this. One of them is to sit Control D, which gives you the next one and inches it over slightly. And then you can adjust as necessary. So Control D is very nice. The other one is if you click Alt and then drag. And that's what your book says to do. It says to hold down Alt and then drag away from this. Now I'm not adding squash and stretch yet. But you can see that they're closer together up here than they are down here until it hits, right? And that's because, whoop, I want to duplicate that one. We want to duplicate each next one in order because we want them to be in order. All right. And the reason we're doing it like this, where they're kind of closer together at the top, is because here it's sort of been released, and so gravity is accelerating it down towards the ground. And then when it bounces, it's going really fast, but then gravity is going to slow it down. It's negative acceleration as gravity pulls against it. Let me bring this here. And then as gravity pulls against it, you can see that it kind of slows down a little bit, but then so these top ones should be closer together than these ones. And then it should get further away again. And I'm probably putting that, too close to the ground. And I'm building it up like this. And so you can feel free, if you're kind of watching this while you work, to pause this. And yeah, this arc is not great. These should be in an arc. And so you can see I kind of put the top of this key in the wrong spot. And you can see that I'm reworking this as I go. This is a key concept I really want you guys to get down. It will not be correct the first time. I'm going to say that again. It's not going to be done correctly the first time. You're going to have to put stuff in here. I probably have one too many frames in here on this side. So it's not going to be equidistant on each side. Or there's not going to be the same number of frames on each side, and that's just the way it goes. It's not going to be exactly right the first time. That's okay, right? That it's not supposed to be. I can already tell that this X is actually in the wrong spot. It's not in the right spot. It's not in the middle. And as I go building this up, I can also tell that these are a little bit too far apart, but you can start to build up a bit of animation. You can start to maybe get the arc in there. I'm already changing my, whoop, I see I double clicked accidentally. Right? And we kind of draw it out. Now this is going to be very, very rough. I suspect you guys will do a better job because won't be talking while you're doing it, and you'll be spending a little bit more time. But you can at least plan the path of these pretty easily while just looking at them. Right? That's step one. Let's say this is done. This is everything I ever hoped and dreamed for in a bouncing ball animation. And now I need to put it together into an animation. So what I need to do now is drag select everything in here and right click, and you'll see there's something called distribute to keyframes. It's going to take each of these items and distribute them into keyframes, which is why it was so important that I click on the last one to duplicate in order to make the next one, because it will go in this order. You'll be able to fix it later if you messed anything up, but right click, distribute to keyframes. Now, my guide disappeared. Yes, because it only exists on the first frame, right? If you want it to exist on all the rest of these frames, you have to come out here, right click, insert frame. You have to add the frames for it to exist. And hey, look at that. Dragging the time marker, dragging the time marker. Let's see what it looks like. Not awesome. It's a little stilted in here, and also I wonder, there's a little bit of a hiccup here. I don't know if that's because it's too many frames. It could be. I could check by clicking this button. This button is the onion skin button, and I can drag this out. It might be that there's too many frames. It also might be that there's a hiccup in the animation. So one thing you guys have to get used to right away is to say control test. Aha, that looks very different. It may be hard to tell once this translates to YouTube, but look how much faster that is. There's no hiccup over here. I was about to start deleting frames. What's happening is that this program is struggling to play all the frames. Probably because I am recording the screen. So what's happening here is the animation isn't baked in yet. It's all editable, and that's a lot to process. And so when I click this button, it draws back here, and it does it differently. Aha, each time. So each time I play it, the timing's a little bit different. So by saying control test, it's actually baking the cake. It's creating a little animation, and I can watch it. And I'm actually not too unhappy with the timing. I wouldn't change anything until I add in squash and stretch. Now you can see it's jumping and getting fast, and then it falls down again. Now I might want to put an extra frame in there so that it hovers a little bit. I could totally do that. So we go to maybe this frame. If you want to add, I need this on. You right click, insert frame. Now it does insert another frame, but notice how it's now the same frame. It's the ball's in the same place twice. I have to right click, insert keyframe now. And it converts it to a keyframe, and now there's going to be two separate frames, but I have to go back and forth in my timeline between these two in order to move them. Right? I have to be on the right frame in the timeline to move the right one of these. This onion skinning, I can't select these. I can't touch them. All right, so you have to get used to moving to the correct point in the timeline in order to move the correct thing. But now, if I test it, my background is blinking off. I added a frame to the top line, but not the bottom. So right click, insert frame, it inserts a frame and extends it out, and now I can watch it. I like that better. I like that there's a little bit of a hover. This is kind of like one of those really large bouncy balls, the way this is bouncing. Alright, I'm going to save this because I want to make sure I'm saving my animation. Alright, now one last thing, if you really want to get into this, if animation is your love and desire in the world and you want to get some practice, squash and stretch. Squash and stretch means grabbing this free transform tool, and it doesn't mean squash this one and stretch this one. It actually means squash and stretch each thing. Meaning if I squash this, well, first of all, let's move the anchor point down here. If I squash this to hit the ground, what do we notice about this? It got smaller. I have to also stretch it, right? Like a water balloon. Like if you squash down on this shape, it expands out sideways. It doesn't just shrink. So you need to make sure it's called maintaining volume if you want the technical term, and turn off snapping if it's not letting you get the tiny increments that you want. But then also this one, if we stretch it, we have to squash it. We also have to rotate it so it points in the right direction. And we can kind of go through, stretch it, and then squash it. And then rotate it, and then we'll see. Ooh. See, it doesn't take much. You can just kind of squash that in there. And you can go through your animation and maybe have it squash a little bit less on this one. So I move this down here. It's not hitting as hard because it's not coming from as far away. So we're squash a little bit, we're stretch it a little bit. If you don't squash it as much, you don't stretch it as much. Same with this. It's not the squash and stretch is meant to imply speed. Like, oh, it's going so fast. It's like gravity's pulling it. It's a very extreme version of relativity, maybe. A lot of this is also based on cartoon conventions. We are simply used to certain things. This one. There are things we are used to, and squash and stretch is one of them, and they follow certain rules. There we go. It's a little much on that second one. I would probably knock it back a little bit. But that was the in-class assignment. This is meant to be practice. Keep in mind, I have been doing this for a while, so you can see I'm working pretty quickly while I'm talking because I've gone through this exercise before. I can also tell you right away that this is the wrong size because it's too small. So it's going to take you time to get used to these things. It's going to take, that's better. It's going to take time to learn how to do this. What I want you to learn from this assignment is that going through the first time, it's not going to be right. Go back and move things around. You grab your time marker and look at this and make adjustments to the location of things. Make adjustments so that it changes the timing. Make adjustments to the squash and stretch. Make changes. It will not be perfect the first time. That's the lesson I want everyone to take away from this.